Aren't you glad you got up this morning and came to church? I was just thinking maybe I should just not preach today and they can just do the rest of the service. You'd be all right with that? No, I'm preaching. That was so good. It was really good. We are so lucky. And there's real truth in that, because it's easy. We're going to talk about this today, but the devil wants nothing more than for you to stay at home, lay in your PJs, drink your coffee. Nothing wrong with that. And just, I'll go to church next week. But when you do that, you miss this. You miss these moments, that experience. So hopefully that's motivation for you to come back again. All right. So real quick question. Have you ever made a series of bad investments before? Yeah. The kind of investment that you thought, hey, this is a good investment, but it turned out to be a horrible investment. I know that I have. Let me give you an example. In the early 2000s, I owned the most amazing car I thought and still think you could own. It was a 1997 forest green Nissan Pathfinder. Now, I love this car. It was an amazing car. It had the bike racks, the snowboard racks on top that I used, had four-wheel drive, gray leather interior, had a CD player, which was a big deal in the early 2000s. It was an amazing car. And it was a 5-speed, which I love to drive a 5-speed. And you can't find trucks or SUVs with 5 speeds anymore. And so I graduated college, and I thought, you know what? I'm a college graduate. I just got a new job. I need an awesome car. So I went to the Nissan dealer. I wrote my name on a piece of paper that apparently told me that I owed them money, and then I drove away in this amazing car, and it was awesome. The problem was I had student loans, and I had just gotten a job as a youth pastor, so I could not afford the car that I just bought, but I didn't seem to care. I drove it off, and it was this amazing car. Well, eventually, I realized, I just can't afford this car. And so in an effort to cut some costs, I decided, you know what? I'm going to sell the car, and I'm going to get a different one. So a couple of very interesting people paid cash for my car. They were traveling hippies, I guess, who sold T-shirts at festivals, and they bought my car. I was sort of sad to sell it to them. I don't know why, but I did. I got the cash. I bought, sold the car, and then I was in a real pinch. I needed a car. I needed transportation. So I just went to the first dealer I could find, and I found this junky little, cheap little car, and I gave my money, and I drove it off. The problem was I bought this very old, high-mileage Mitsubishi Mirage. It was basic, and when I say basic, it had nothing automatic. Like, you had to open the doors with the key. Everything was, just very standard, very basic. The seats were uncomfortable. The exterior was just terrible, and I'm pretty sure the power steering hardly worked at all. And when you drove it, it sounded more like a blender than a car. It was that kind of car. Well, within days, I realized I had just made a huge mistake. This was a bad thing. About a week or two into owning what eventually my wife and I would affectionately call Mitzi, the car started to do some weird things. Every light on the dashboard suddenly just came on. Like every single light. I couldn't get the car started very easily. It would die without any notice. Driving along the road, it would just stop running. So I took it back to the dealer. Now, keep in mind, this is a very old car. There is no warranty. It's very, very used. So I come to find out that the computer system in the car had failed. These are very expensive items for a car to have. But I was out of options. I didn't know what to do, so I had him put in a new computer, and it cost me hundreds of dollars. Well, 2 weeks later, it was in the shop again, and then again, and then again. And I eventually realized that I had dropped more money into the car than I had paid for it within the first 2 months of owning it. So I was frustrated. Why is somebody clapping? Why would you clap at that? Who was that? Been there. Okay, all right, very good. Okay, not alone. Solidarity, very good. So I was frustrated. I was sick of driving this hoopty down the street, and I decided, you know what, enough is enough. And so I went down to the Nissan dealer, and I bought a brand new Nissan Frontier. And upon coming home, I realized that was not a good investment, because now I was upside down in a brand new car that I didn't even really want, And it would only last about a year until we had kids, and I realized this truck is not going to work with kids in the back. And so I had to turn around and get something different. And bad investment after bad investment after bad investment happened. A cycle of bad investments, you might call it. And you do that enough, and you will find yourself broke or with little to show for all of the investing you did. You've been there, right? Maybe not with a car. Could have been something else. But here's the deal. Like the purchase of a car or an IRA or a home or any other investment that you make choices every day that invest in the person that you are becoming. They will either be good investments or they will be bad investments. But you are making investments in the person that you're becoming every single day. The question is, what kind of investments will we make? Well, we're in this third week of this series called Death to Selfie, and it's a series we've been looking at how we can put to death this life that we've had, like I mentioned earlier, and become the person that God wants us to be. And in the first week, we looked at that Jesus offers this new life, a new life that is guarded by freedom and grace and love and forgiveness, that is not subject to all of the expectations and obligations that the world puts on us, but it allows us to live this free life within God, within Jesus. And so we want to exchange that old life that we've lived for this new life in Jesus, to live under grace and freedom. But to do that, we learned last week that we're going to have to live a no filters kind of life, which means that we're going to have to be real honest about who we are, about what we struggle with, about what it means to follow Jesus. And second, we're going to talk about today, we're going to have to make good investments in who we are becoming, which I think is our greatest struggle. It's our greatest struggle. Because here's what investments are. A bad investment is sacrificing the future for the present. And a good investment is sacrificing the present for the future. Let me say that again and write it down if you need to. A bad investment is sacrificing the future for the present. I need a car and I need it now. So I make a bad investment, which is an investment in now, but the future, it doesn't reap what I would hope it would, right? A good investment is sacrificing the present. I can be patient, I can wait, I can withhold, I can stand off for something better in the future. And you make these kinds of investments every single day of your life. You decide, will I make a bad investment in this moment, or will I make a good investment in this moment? And so today we're going to look at how it is that we can end the cycle of bad investments in our lives, end the cycle of the bad investments that we are making every single day that are moving us away from becoming the person that God wants us to be, and learn how we can be people who make good investments that look to the future and sacrifice the present for something better. Now, I wish I could say I was the only one that ever talked about this, but you know I'm never that clever. And so fortunately, we have this guy named Paul who writes a lot about this kind of thing. In fact, Paul is one of the first leaders in the church, and he starts these churches all over the known world at the time, around modern-day Turkey, Israel, Italy, that area, Asia Minor. And as he does, he would start a church, and then he would move on to another one, and then he would write back to these churches that he started, and he would hear things through the grapevine, and he would talk to them, and he would challenge them, and he would encourage them, and he would motivate them to become the person that Jesus was calling them to be, the community that Jesus was calling them to be. And so as he did, he would talk a lot about this cycle of bad investments that the churches were making, bad investments in the kinds of people they were becoming. And he would talk about the need to stop sacrificing the immediate, instead sacrificing your future for the immediate, and instead sacrifice the immediate for a better future. So in one of the letters, the letter or book of Colossians, he writes about this. So if you have your phone, you can open up to the YouVersion app and follow along that way. It's totally free, great resource. Make sure you get that, or if you have a Bible, you can do that as well, okay? Colossians chapter 3, verses 5 through 10. Now, again, he's writing to a church that he has helped start, and he is addressing the bad investments that the people of this church are making. And he's going to tell them, here's what you need to do. And this is what he says. He says, so put to death the sinful earthly things lurking within you. Have nothing to do with sexual immorality, impurity, lust, and evil desires. Don't be greedy, for a greedy person is an idolater, worshiping the things of this world. Because of these sins, the anger of God is coming. You used to do these things when your life was still part of this world, but now is the time to get rid of anger, rage, malicious behavior, slander, and dirty language. Don't lie to each other, for you've stripped off your old sinful nature and all its wicked deeds. Put on your new nature and be renewed as you learn to know your Creator and become like Him. Now, when this letter was written, it was actually written in Greek, which was the common language at the time. And so I did a little digging, and I found that the original Greek word that Paul uses for that phrase, put to death, is the word nekrosati. Nekrosati, which is derived from the word nekros. And I did a little digging, and I realized, man, there's some rich meaning to this word. And this word that is translated put to death, I found that the word actually means put to death. Kill it. Murder it. The translators actually got this one right, in other words. Paul is being very specific. You need to put to death these bad investments that you continue to make in your life. Put to death the sinful choices that you make every single day. We ought to kill it, murder it, put it to death, eliminate it forever. Because here's the thing, gossip is a bad investment. So kill it. It's destroying your trust and your respect and your worth as a friend. Giving into lust is a bad investment. So kill it. It's tarnishing the beauty of sex and marriage, and it's driving you away from your spouse or your eventual spouse. Greed is a bad investment. It needs to be killed. It keeps you from becoming generous with what you've been given and investing in something bigger than yourself. Laziness is a bad investment. It keeps you from providing for yourself and your family, and it leaves the opportunity to live a productive life behind. The list goes on and on and on, but Paul is saying, kill the bad investments because they are not leading you to the place that God desires you to be. They are not enabling you to become the person that Jesus intends for you to be. And so instead, he says, put on this new nature, this new life, and he says this very specifically, become like your Creator. Become like Jesus. We talk about that, right? Like a changed life is somebody who's becoming more and more like Jesus Christ. And so Paul says to do that, you've got to kill those things that are bad investments in who you're becoming and put on this new nature and begin to make good investments in who you're becoming that you might look and become more like Jesus. And so then the question really becomes, well, that's great, Paul, but how do we actually go about doing that? Because my guess is that there are things coming to mind for you right now that you know, I make bad investments in this area or in this area. And you know what? I've been battling against that for most of my life, and I don't know how to move beyond that. I don't know how to put that to death. How do we do that? How do we start to make better investments in who we're becoming and kill those bad investments that we're constantly making? Well, first of all, it's important to recognize that you have been caught in a cycle of bad investments for years. You have been making the same kinds of choices, like a cycle of bad investments for years. In other words, we all have a few things that we continue to make bad investments in. A few things that are keeping us from becoming more and more like our Creator. And the cycle of these investments seems endless at times. We make the bad investment, we feel bad about it, we decide to change them, and then eventually we do it again. And the cycle goes round and round and round. So how do we put these cycles of bad investments to death? How do we end the cycle of bad investments? Well, the first thing you have to be able to do is know what I call your designer baits. It's important to know that while God loves you and He desires you to become the person He always intended, you also have an enemy Satan, who desires you to continue to make those bad investments, sacrificing who you could become for the very present. He wants nothing more than to watch you live a life filled with greed and lust and laziness and anger and gossip, and the list goes on and on. So long as you do that, he knows that you will never become like your Creator. And to do that, Satan has designer baits specifically for you. Lures that are shiny and look nice and that you specifically are attracted to. Now, that lure may not work for the person sitting next to you, but for you, it's hard not to snap and bite at that lure every time you see it. James chapter 1, he talks about this. He says, a temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. And these desires give birth to sinful actions, and when sin is allowed to grow, it gives birth to death. Some translations say that the temptation lures us and drags us away. Satan has crafted these shiny lures that catch your eye and tempt you in ways that other lures might not. The opportunity to talk about your coworkers presents itself, and you just can't help it. You just got to go for it. I want to talk about Jimmy too. The woman walks by, and you just can't help but look and imagine. The opportunity to watch another episode on Netflix at work, it comes around and you just have to bite. Just seems like such a better option. The anger wells up inside you, and you just can't seem to help but lose your temper again. Each of us has these lures. Satan has crafted them specifically to you, to bring you down, to keep you from becoming who Jesus wants you to become. And we need to recognize them and know them. Call them out. That is a designer bait for me. Lust is a designer bait. Greed is a designer bait. Anger is a designer bait for me. And when we begin to know them, we can actually do something about them. And the first thing that we can do is remove obstacles. Hebrews 12:1 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. I mean, many times the reason we make a bad investment, we make a sinful decision, is simply by the fact that we put ourselves in bad positions. We don't give ourselves even a chance to overcome it. We allow obstacles to get in the way toward a greater future. For instance, if you wanted to start eating better and lose some weight and become a healthier physical person, but you continued to stock your shelves with sugary, fatty, processed foods, how do you think that that would go? Badly. You would continue to eat poorly. You would not become healthy. So one way to begin to overcome that is to get rid of some of the obstacles, to stock your shelves in the fridge with healthy food. Don't even give yourself the option. If you want to quit an addiction, it's important to know those things that trigger you, those things, those people, those places that make it easy for you to give in to temptation. If you're an alcoholic, the worst place for you to go is a bar. Just don't go there. Remove the obstacle. Give yourself a chance. When you start to know what those designer baits, you can remove obstacles that at least give you the opportunity to overcome those things. If when you get together with a group of people and all you do is gossip and talk about people behind their backs, you might need some new friends. You might need to remove yourself from their company. So remove the obstacles. Thirdly, have a plan. To end these cycles of bad investments, you can't just hope it happens automatically. Have a plan. Despite knowing what your designer baits are and removing some obstacles, you're going to be tempted. Things are going to happen. And you're going to be faced with opportunities to make bad investments again, which is why you need to have a plan for what to do when you're faced with certain temptation. When faced with the opportunity to gossip, have a plan to deal with it. Maybe you realize, like, my plan is to just excuse myself from the conversation, to change the subject, to confess that, hey, this is a struggle for me and I don't really want to be a part of this. Have a plan. If your designer's bait is overspending, have a plan for how to deal with it. Maybe you shouldn't go to the mall when you have free time. And if you're there, walk out of the store, put the item down, decide beforehand what you're going to do when that temptation comes your way. If your cycle of bad investments is anger, have a plan to do. When you start to feel that anger and that rage well up inside of you, remind yourself of that plan to walk away. Take a deep breath. Admit that you're feeling angry and you need a break. Have a back pocket plan so when you're faced with the temptation, be prepared to fight through it. So many of us just leave this to chance. And Satan is much cleverer than we give him credit for. Know your designer baits, remove obstacles, have a plan. Fourth, repeat the truth. Satan is a deceiver. He is a liar. He will convince you of things that you didn't even know you could be convinced of. He will make it so attractive that you won't even be able to turn your head the other direction. And as a result, it is likely that you have resolved that this is just who you are. You're a gossip. You're greedy. You're a womanizer. You're an addict. You're selfish. You're arrogant. But the truth is, if you are in Jesus, you aren't any of those things. And that is a lie that you have believed for too long. And you've believed it so long that you have decided that this is just who I will always be. But the truth is that it is not who you always have to be. You can end the cycles of bad investments in your life no matter what it might be. Look at what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, which, by the way, is one of the most misquoted scriptures in all of the Bible. But nevertheless, this is what it actually says. It says, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. That's right. Everyone in this room, we're all in this together. There's no one in here who doesn't get tempted. And it says, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure. In other words, there is no temptation that comes your way that is too great for you to overcome when you're following Jesus, when you know the truth. God will not allow you to be tempted more than you can stand. But to do it, you have to be reminded of the truth. You've got to repeat that truth over and over and over again. We need to know what God says about us and who God is calling us to become. It's why we encourage you to be in the Bible daily, reading God's truth, knowing this is who you are. You are not just a womanizer. You are not just somebody who's greedy. You are a child of God who has been forgiven and has given you the ability and the strength to overcome whatever temptation might come your way. That is the truth that we need to remind ourselves as we're faced with temptation on a daily basis. When faced with temptation from Satan in the desert, Jesus repeated the truth over and over again. Satan tempted him, and Jesus came back with the truth, what the Bible says. With each temptation, Jesus combated Satan with God's truth. And we can do the same, to know it and to repeat it, to constantly be fighting against the temptations that come our ways, the lies about who we are with the truth. Which leads to the final thing we got to do. We got to do this if we want to overcome fighting off temptation and making bad investments in our lives. We have to focus on Jesus. Look, those first four things that I just talked to you about, they're really helpful, don't get me wrong. But if you do that apart from focusing on Jesus, you will lose the battle. In the end, Jesus is the one who gives us the strength to be able to overcome whatever might come our way. That bad investment that you've been making all of your life, the only way that you can fully overcome that is when you give your life to Jesus and say, I don't have the strength to do this on my own. I need you. I need you, Jesus, to come into my life and give me the power and strength to become like you. Hebrews 12, 1-2 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a huge crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. In the end, it is Jesus who gives us the strength to end the cycle of bad investments. It is Him who moves us to make good investments in who we are becoming, sacrificing the present for a greater future. It is Him who makes the devil run.